Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 356 of the Juicebox Podcast. On today's show, I'll be speaking with Dan. Now, Dan is the father of a child with type 1 diabetes. Dan is also a fellow podcaster. He has a very popular podcast, and he's good at talking. So there's two people here. What am I trying to say? There are going to be a lot of words spoken in the next hour and 20 minutes or so, however long this episode is. I had a great time. I was in a mindset when I recorded this about thinking about helping people. So the podcast sort of follows that vein a little bit. It's also just a terrific conversation about what Dan has learned about type 1 diabetes so far. I'll ask that you please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. As the episode starts up, it's interesting that it was recorded just a few months before the coronavirus, COVID-19 hit. So there's the story about what it's like to have your kids at home during a school strike. It kind of feels quaint at this point. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Contour Next One blood glucose meter and Touched by Type 1. If you take a moment to visit touchedbytype1.org, you'll see programs, awareness campaigns, and ways for you to get involved. Touched by Type 1 has programs and services for those living with the daily reality of type 1 diabetes. They offer supportive community with many interactive programs and creative resources designed to empower people with type 1 to thrive. Touchedbytype1.org. The Contour Next One blood glucose meter. Absolutely terrific. Small, easy to use, easy to read, super bright light for overnight. Beautiful test strips that you can go back in and test again with if you missed the blood drop the first time or you don't get quite enough. And speaking of those test strips, did you know it's possible that your copay for test strips is more than you might pay if you just bought them in cash? Check out contournext.com/juicebox to find out if that may be your situation. While you're there, you'll be able to look into what I think is the greatest blood glucose meter on the market. It's the one Arden's been using for well over a year now, and it is without a doubt better than every other meter she's ever had. That is no over-exaggeration. The accuracy alone, amazing. Usability, second to none. I just love it. It's perfect. contournext.com/juicebox. Head over there today, take a look. You've probably been using the same old busted up meter forever. You don't even know how accurate it is. How long ago was that thing made? Right? Do you even look into those things? Luckily for you, Arden's using one of the best available, and they're sponsors of the show. contournext.com/juicebox. Head on over. There are links to all of the advertisers at juiceboxpodcast.com and right there in the notes of your podcast player. Thank you for supporting the show. Let's get started. How are you?
I'm good. We're the end of the second week of a school strike here in Chicago, and I have two teenagers walking around upstairs, so hopefully they won't be making too much of a racket.
Bored out of their minds?
They're very happy. I'm out of my mind.
Let me get this right, in 4th or 5th grade, and my school went on strike, and it ended up being the longest teacher strike in the history of Pennsylvania. And we were out for a little over 3 months.
Wow.
We came back, watched, my God, film strips of, what was that? He was like, I can't believe I can't think of this. I'm a big kind of Persian guy with a sword, no shirt, would like go into a cave and take jewels and stuff. Like these were very popular, like, television movies back then. God, I can't think of it.
I don't remember that.
And I'll think
not Alibaba.
Something very close, right?
Yeah. Okay.
We watched those for 2 days, and then no lie, it was summer vacation.
And how do you think that has impacted your life?
I know exactly how it has, actually.
Yeah.
I'm an incredibly big fan of the television show MASH because of it.
Interesting.
That's the only thing I know that came of it. Although I've never seen my parents happier than the day the strike was announced as ending. They genuinely looked elated when when they realized we were going. I mean, 3 months it threw people's lives out of whack, you know.
Yeah, well, I work at home, so it's like every day is take your child to work day.
I'm just telling you, I just recently watched every episode of MASH while I was, cooking and doing things like that. But I know almost every word of every episode. Like as soon as it starts, I'm like, oh, this is the one where, because it ran ad nauseum on television. And at some point we were out of things to do. Kids even stopped playing with each other. It was just like, we were like, oh my God, this is never going to end. And we all just sort of reverted back into our houses and watched TV. So anyway.
It's a fascinating social experiment. I hope we won't have to experience it here.
Your children will only excel as high as podcaster one day, apparently, if they stay out of school too long.
Well, we recently were doing 6-word biographies, and I came up with too much school, now a podcaster.
I mean, you get bored, right? Anyway, so Dan, I did something that I do every once in a while on purpose. I did not go back and look at our correspondence because I thought you're talking, I don't know if you're doing it for a living or not, but I figured you and I could find something to talk about. So,
yeah, I do it for a living, probably like you do.
Yeah, right. Which is to say that if one advertiser pulls out, I better go get a job. So first, let's start slow, right?
Yep.
What's your connection introduce yourself and what's your connection to type 1?
Yeah, so I'm Dan Liebenson. My son, Sam, was diagnosed about 5 years ago when he was 11. And I started listening to your podcast, and I remember thinking, I think Arden and Sam are around the same age. And I remember you saying that, it's been 9 years or something like that. And I thought that was an eternity. And, I was never going to figure it all out. And, so then I was thinking, here I am 5 years later and more or less figured it out. So I thought that would be an interesting conversation between us.
It certainly would be. Okay, so what's your son's name, are we going to say?
Yeah, his name is Sam.
Sam or Dan?
Sam.
Sam, sorry.
He's Sam, I'm Dan.
I knew you were Dan. I just thought I got caught in my ear a little bit. Okay, so for instance, when I tell people my son's name is Cole, a surprising number of them say Paul. It's a thing that happens. So, okay. So Sam's diagnosed, tell me again, what age?
He was 11. And
this is 5 years ago, so 20...
Yeah.
14?
Or I guess almost, at this point, almost 6 years ago. So 2014.
2014. Okay. So, all right. So he's, and how old is he today?
Yeah. So now he's 16, almost 17.
Okay. Yeah. And Arden's 15. She'll be 16 in the summer. So she's probably a good year and a half younger than he is.
Uh-huh.
All right, cool. So, first question, always huge surprise out of left field, or were you one of the families who was like, "Oh, it got Sam"? We were wondering.
No, total surprise. There's nobody that we know of in our family that has ever been type 1. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that our closest friend's daughter was diagnosed with type 1 about a year before, so we were familiar with it. But the idea that 2 different kids in 2 close families are going to be diagnosed a year from one another was shocking. So it was like a double shock.
Are you in the suburbs of Chicago, or are you in the city?
We are in the city, in the south side near the University of Chicago.
Okay, yeah. And so now you know 2 people. One of them's your son. Other kids, you have another son, obviously.
I have a daughter, a son and a daughter.
Oh, yeah, yep. two teenagers upstairs, not 2 boys upstairs, right?
Yep.
And so what happens first? Like, especially in a big city like that, I'm interested in the diagnosis in a place where my imagination tells me the healthcare should be pretty top notch.
Yeah, well, first of all, the interesting little story, it was kind of a legendary story in the hospital. It was slightly, not exactly what actually happened, but the story that was going around was that Sam's little friend diagnosed him because what happened was that he had been going to the bathroom a lot and thirsty and everything. And because we had these friends who had just recently been diagnosed with type 1, I had in my head that it could be we should test his blood sugar, who knows. And so we went over to their house for dinner, and said, "Can we borrow your blood glucose meter just to test his blood?" And we tested his blood, and I think it was something like 495. And we were like, the truth is that we should have just gone right to the hospital. We didn't really know that much at that time, so we were like, "Oh, we'll go in the morning." Mm-hmm. So I think we borrowed the meter and tested him again in the morning, and it was still high. And so we headed for the hospital, and we live right near the University of Chicago. So yeah, it's a top-notch hospital. There's a children's hospital. There's a world famous, group of endocrinologists. Later, I want to discuss that even though you're in a place with world famous endocrinologists, it's one thing that they kind of understand the underlying way the disease works, but it's another thing whether they actually know how to help you manage it. But yeah, I mean, I think that now it's kind of faded into memory, but I think, this sort of team of doctors descended on him and tested all kinds of things and, pretty quickly came back and said, yeah, it's type 1.
What happened in his life that made you think to ask for the meter?
He was going to the bathroom all the time. And subsequently, he said that he was thirsty all the time. I don't think we realized that he was thirsty all the time, but I think we were noticing that he was going to the bathroom all the time. And I think that it was just that we had this friend who had been diagnosed a year before. So it was on our minds. I think if we didn't know about her, it probably would have taken a lot longer until we had done something, because it hadn't risen to the level that something happened and we have to get medical attention. It was just kind of like, well, we go to these folks' house every week, and, so when we're there next time, let's get out the blood glucose meter and just see.
Yeah, no kidding. And so he wasn't really complaining about other things. He wasn't experiencing headaches or dizziness, or he wasn't that far into it, I guess.
I mean, not that I recall. It's, in retrospect, it's like, maybe he was. I don't really remember. It certainly hadn't risen to the level of a concern. Yeah. And he wasn't having, any kind of DKA kind of symptoms that we knew of.
How did he react?
He was pretty cool about it. I mean, he kind of, I don't know if it was that he's just a pretty cool kid or he was at a particular age, but he was just kind of like, okay, well, or that he had a really close friend, but he was like, all right, I'll do this stuff. The thing that he was horrified by was that I was going to come over to school every day until, we figured it all out to, test his blood sugar and give him insulin. I mean, this was before we had the pump, and that was horrifying to him that his dad was going to come to school every day. That was the biggest concern.
Well, it probably took him years to set up the backstory that you were a foreign correspondent and didn't live at home. And, he probably had a whole big thing worked up that you were, pop in all of a sudden like, oh, here's Dan. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. He may have.
I know I said he was playing for the Bulls 20 years ago, but this is right. Him. Yeah. No, I get that. Like, Arden's good with the me being there when I'm there. They're very infrequently at school. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's obvious, but not often at all. But yep. I happened to be there yesterday, and we were walking down the hall laughing and talking, and we went and did what we were going to do and headed back again. She was she put an insulin pump site in, and it hurt a little going in, and she mentioned it. She goes, that wasn't good. And I was like, okay. Mm-hmm. But it worked really well for like a day and a half, so we didn't think anything of it. And then she's bolusing for lunch, and she said she bolused, and she left her room. She went to her locker, and she's standing in her locker getting her stuff together. And her pod just, errors in the middle of the bolus. So she's like, she sends me a text. My pod just errored. I'm really hungry. I want to eat. And I was like, okay. So I've said this before. I mean, we live literally across the street from the school, so we don't leave a lot of supplies at the school. I'm home working usually. And so, I said, oh, I'm on my way. It's like, just go to the front office. And I walked in the front office just as she did. And she's got her hand over the pod trying to muffle the beeping. Uh-huh. And she's just like, hey, take my bag, because I'm not taking my hand off of this. It's really loud. It's under my pants and I can't get it off right now. And, I need to get somewhere and take care of it. So fine, like we went and did it, but we're walking through the hallway. She's got her hand like awkwardly on her thigh, and we're walking and talking about something completely different other than diabetes, and she's laughing and I'm laughing, and I just thought, well, this is incredibly normal to us. Like there's no real weirdness about this at all. We went in, did what we did, and she was back on her way again, and I was home. I bet I was home 14 minutes after I left my house. It was really interesting how little it impacted my psychological feelings about the day. And I think for her too. So
yeah, it's like at a certain point, it's like, the Navy SEALs or something where you just, your drill and you go right in, you're in, you're out. It's fine in those early years, or those early days, especially when a kid, you're 11, it's just the idea that your parent's going to show up is horrifying.
Yeah.
Now, as a junior in high school, it's fine,
Yeah.
and also we've finally learned to leave a box of stuff there.
So far. I mean, if I lived 5 minutes farther away or I wasn't working from home, we would just pile the stuff up in there. But it was good too, because it was a weird timing. Like, it was before a meal. So then we had to do some kind of, some juice box math about how much insulin to put in, because now there wasn't going to be a pre-bolus and she's going to have to eat faster. And we kind of handled all that stuff and went on our way. You said that thing about the Navy SEALs, and it made me picture in my head, 12 Navy SEALs sitting around eating pizza, drinking beer with a little chyron underneath them that says 8 minutes since they killed somebody. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, they're back home now and just back to their lives. And, hours before that, they were surfacing in the surf, with their night vision on, and now they're home.
Right. This is like the opposite, where you've saved somebody.
Yeah, exactly. It's my mind.
Maybe it's like the fire department.
Yeah. Well, we're talking. What's going on in the world right now made me think of going to get somebody instead of going to help somebody. But
right.
Anyway, so he's leaves the hospital with pens, pump. How did that go?
Yeah. No. He. So I think that because we had these friends that had been diagnosed a year before, so they kind of had been through the whole series. And by the time Sam was diagnosed, they already had a pump and a Dexcom. And so right away, we went in knowing that we should ask for pens, not just, vials of insulin and syringes. And so we came out with pens. And then I think very, very quickly, within maybe a month, maybe two, we had him on a pump and a Dexcom. And that was only because we had these friends who knew exactly what we should ask for, had gone to the same hospital, the same endocrinology practice, and knew exactly which doctor is free and easy prescribing the pump, and exactly what we need to do and everything. So we kind of had this whole again, it was kind of like the Navy SEALs. We had this whole, we knew exactly what to do, and that's one of the things that's really stuck with me all along. It's that we were so lucky that we had these friends that also, right, if they had been diagnosed, 5 years ago, they might have forgotten the whole process. And
right.
So, but because it was so fresh, they could tell us exactly what to do. And we called it copy paste. We just did exactly what they did on everything. Mm-hmm. And it made the process so much smoother and so much easier for Sam and as importantly for us. Yeah. That it's kind of stuck in my mind, and it's annoyed me and my wife ever since that other people don't have that same experience, and it's been frustrating to try to figure out how to give people that experience.
Well, what you just said made me consider, my first thought was, every institution should have an advocate, like a third party who comes and chats with you and explains stuff to you and tries to point you in a direction that they feel like you're comfortable with. And then I thought, why isn't the staff the advocate? And that, so there's a disconnect there somehow. But I just think it's, you had that one person. Why couldn't that one person just exist off in a side office, doing something else and waiting for somebody to be diagnosed with type 1? That seems strange.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I think it has to do with liability, because it might also have to do with experience, and that people don't quite know, the staff doesn't quite know what people are thinking or what they need or something. It's a little hard to believe. I mean, I think they have a lot of experience. They know that. But I think that because we've tried to even get the hospital to start a program where, as a newly diagnosed person, a family, obviously if they agree to it, if they sign whatever HIPAA waivers or whatever, but that a family could come in and help them, and that we could come in, or our son could come in and just give them some tips and tell them that they're not alone, and everything, by the way, that for me, the Juicebox podcast did in those early years, but that we could do that in person. And they've been very slow, or really not at all able to make that happen. And they haven't really said why, but I suspect that it has to do with liability issues. And they're not necessarily wrong in that, right? Because I think about the advice that I give people when there's a rare opportunity for me to give somebody advice. And I know everything on the Juicebox podcast is not medical advice or otherwise. But, and that's also true when I talk to people independently. But, I have all kinds of specific tips on how to figure out the basal and how to figure out the bolus and all of that stuff. And I think that if some random parent came in and gave somebody that advice under the auspices of the hospital and then something went wrong, there's going to be liability issues. So I kind of get why they don't do it. But on the other hand, there seems to be like there should be some middle ground or something, some way to get advice.
Well, I think that, you hit on a lot of good points. I do think it's the idea that they don't want to be culpable on any like bad decisions that get made. I think that all you need to know is that there are a lot of medical institutions around the country and probably, around the world who, when somebody there will tell you, hey, you should listen to this podcast. Yeah. Which I think is their way of saying, I know you're going to hear what you need to hear there, and yet I'm not telling it to you. But then again, if they direct you to it, even like how does it's all just sort of posturing and bullshit. If I'm being, I'm gonna have to beep that, which just gave me something extra to do while we're editing. But that's what it is, really. Right? It's just it's the idea that everything's so confusing that you can't give anybody targeted advice. But I don't believe that's true. I think if people understand the basic stuff, like the core value stuff, then they can build out from it. I think where the institutions fall short, maybe where the podcast doesn't, and interestingly enough, the podcast was only able to find its way because I wasn't rushed, right? Like I was taking my time kind of building out a narrative, is that there are these core things. Like as much as we like to say your diabetes may vary and it's definitely going to be different for you than it is for him, there are some basic concepts that are not different for everybody. They are all exactly the same. And why not start them with those at the very least?
Right. You know? Yeah. And there's some things that I think also just require a little bit more time to spend with somebody than the endo office really, I think, is able to, right? They just have a lot of patients and they don't have that amount of time. And one thing that as a parent volunteer, you're happy to do is, I'm not meeting with all the patients. I'm just meeting with some of them, and I could spend a lot more time counseling them and emailing them and going back and forth with them. And so for example, there was one family that we know that was diagnosed relatively recently, and we really tried to do what our friends had done for us, and we really pushed them to get on a pump quickly, and they did. And then, I checked in with them a couple months later, how are things going? And they were expressing a lot of frustration that he was still always over 300 or whatever. And, they had an endo appointment coming up in a couple of weeks, and then they would, ask them what to do, and they would make some adjustments. But, they were being so conservative. And I said, well, just double the amount of insulin that you're using. It's still not going to, it's going to go maybe to 200. You're not going to go low. Don't worry about it. Like at this level, if you use twice as much insulin as you're using, my prediction is that you're just going to float around 200 rather than 300. So try it. Like nothing, and you're on a Dexcom, so you're going to see if something's going wrong. Like why not just fool around with it? And they had no capacity to do that. Nobody had told them you could do that. They had sort of put the fear of God into them, that a little mistake could be disastrous. And I'm like, a big mistake could be disastrous, but if you're just adding a little bit more insulin to sort of see what happens, and we're talking about 300 and you're having another unit, like nothing bad is going to happen, and you're going to start to get some experience. And people just have nobody tells them that, and nobody coaches them through that.
It's fascinating to watch people. So I talk to a fair amount of people privately, and I'll tell you, going back to what you said a minute ago, when I speak to you privately, if I ever speak to you privately, the first thing I'm going to say to you is, look, I'm not a doctor. This isn't advice. I know you've heard the podcast and I might seem like an entity to you, but I am a person. I am just the father of a kid with type 1 diabetes, maybe no differently than you are. If I, in the course of sharing any of my personal narrative here with you on the phone today, say something that you misunderstand or that leads to the injury or death of somebody, it's not my fault. Are we okay with that? Which is a weird way to start a phone call with the person you've never met before, but in order to sit down and really talk to them and share kind of the breadth of what they need to understand, you're going to have to say a lot, and a lot can get confusing sometimes, which is why I always tell them, look, just please let's not go into detail here. If your blood sugar is high, you probably need more insulin. This episode of the podcast will probably cover that. Try this, go there, listen to this. Be a little more aggressive, trust yourself more, like very common ideas. It's so funny when you were just talking, you were mimicking, like I could think of episodes of the podcast that you were mimicking while you were talking, and I felt incredibly proud. I thought this is really nice. Like I'm certain you could have come, and maybe you did come to what you just said completely on your own, but there was like certain phrasing you used where I was like, oh, I've said those words. I was like, that's really cool that it found you in Chicago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and that you're trying to find other people with it. The best I can tell you is that I don't know if there's a way to cover people one-on-one, because there's always a concern that pops into people's minds that stops them from saying fully what they mean to say, or the staff's not trained as well as it could be, or they don't live with diabetes or have it. And so they never know the right things to say. I think at this point, you can put me in a situation with a person and I sort of instinctively remember to say the things that need to be said. Mm-hmm. And that's difficult sometimes, because sometimes if you leave out one certain little part, everything else does get messed up. And then you run into what you were talking about, where people's confidence is just very low and they don't want to make any adjustments, even when they are incredibly common sense adjustments. I mean, honestly, your blood sugar is 300. I wish it was lower. Insulin makes your blood sugar go down. Try more insulin wasn't the first thing they did.
Yeah, but I think what they're afraid of is that if my insulin is like, I understand that if my blood sugar is too high, I should try more insulin. But the fear is, but what if I have too much? And I think that the explanation is initially, so just have a little, which is definitely going to be less than any amount that would cause a disaster.
Right.
Especially if you have a Dexcom and you can actually watch it happening.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah. If you're at 300, if my son is at 300, stable, right, I'm going to give him like 4 or 5 units to get him down to 100. But you, newly diagnosed person, just give 2 units and see what happens, right? That is not going to go low. And that is only going to start to give you a little bit of experience seeing what insulin does. But people have been made to be afraid of even that. And that's the part that I feel like I'm trying to break through to folks and say, yeah, don't do things that, yes, I should give the whole caveat that you just did about, right, if anything bad happens and I don't want to be responsible. But I'm trying to give you advice that almost certainly can't even make anything truly bad happen. It's just, so it's just to get you away from the fear of giving a little bit more and seeing what happens, or playing with the basal rates a little bit on your pump, and not waiting 3 months until your next endo appointment.
Yeah. I have to tell you, the amount of times that I hear the I don't know, is it the dough? Like oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of that sound in the silence in people's conversations is fascinating. I spoke to somebody yesterday who I've been talking to on and off for a really long time. And they contacted me and they was like, hey, we're using way too much bolus insulin and hardly any basal insulin. And when I said, is it this? No. Is it that? No. And I went to the third thing. She says, oh, that's probably it. And then you could hear in her voice, she went, okay. I should have known that. Like, do you know what I mean? Like that moment where it's just like, how did I not see it? But I think that when you're in it, it's hard to see.
Yeah.
I think, and that's for most people. For most people, and I really mean this, and I say it every once in a while, but you're living your life, you're doing things. And those things are, from emptying the waste paper basket in the bathroom to dusting something that needs to be dusted, grocery shopping, going to work, cutting your lawn, getting the mail, paying your bills, all these crazy amounts of things that you do. And you really do need to step back from diabetes, let everything else go away and look at it. I don't think most people have that kind of time. I think that's just the truth about life. Like, there's not a ton of time for stuff. And now all of a sudden you're putting in this thing that kind of needs you to be, a little retrospective, a little forward looking, and you got to make a leap. You got to go against what the doctor might have told you for a second in your head so you can find the answer. I don't know who's got that kind of time,
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that inspired me to reach out to you was that this other family that we sort of casually knew. I mean, we didn't really know them very well, but they were basically friends of friends, and their son was diagnosed. And at first, we immediately reached out and said, anything that we can do we'd be happy to. And they were reluctant. They didn't want to impose on our time. The kid was kind of concerned, didn't really, was what the kid I think was also around 11 or 12 or actually maybe even 14 and was very self-conscious about it and didn't really want to be overly involved. And so there was a while where we just kind of reached out every once in a while and said, how are you doing? But at a certain point, they got in touch with me and said, it's just not going well. He's constantly super high and we can't figure it out. And I said, well, let me sit down with you and try to figure it out. And there, by the way, I'm sure, that most of what I know I've gotten from the Juicebox podcast and from our friends that were a year ahead of us, that very little actual practical understanding of how to manage and how to do pump settings and everything have I actually gotten from the Endo office. So I wonder if what I've got comes directly from the Juicebox podcast or I've sort of made it up based on that. But I ended up figuring out what was kind of a 3-step process that worked. And I was so excited that, I had helped somebody that I kind of wanted to have a conversation with you about what it looks like when you can actually help somebody and how we might be able to amplify that in the world.
Cool.
So I don't know so here's I don't know if this is definitely should have the caveat of anything you hear on the Juicebox podcast is not advice, medical or otherwise, but I'm curious what you think about this 3-step process that I came up with and whether it's something that you've been advocating as well.
I would love to hear.
Okay, so the first step I said was at night, find a basal rate that keeps you stable at night. Right, because at night you're not doing anything. So if you can stay stable at night at any number, at 400, at 300, it doesn't matter. As long as you're staying stable at night, you have a decent place to start in terms of a basal rate. And just set that basal rate for the whole day. Obviously you're going to have to change it down the road in the daytime, but that's a basic beginning point for a basal rate. At the point at which you have that stable basal rate, now play around with a correction factor to try to bring it down from that stable number. So let's say it's 300 at night. Figure out, well, if I give 1 unit, where does that take me? Ideally, it should still be stable because you've got the basal rate right. And over time, you can figure out what the correction factor needs to be in order to, what amount of what number BG is going to go down based on how much insulin you give. So now you've got those 2 variables. And then the third one, once you have those 2 figured out, is just to figure out the mealtime bolus. And again, you do that through experimentation, trial and error. Just keep changing the numbers and see at what point you kind of get back to stable within 2 or 3 hours, whatever your goal is. And then you pretty much have it. And the problem with doing that through the Endo is that they're only doing it every 3 months. They're moving all the variables at the same time. They're trying to make their best guess on how to change things. And that's not how you can really get these adjustments really quickly. You have to change them every week or every few days. And if you have no basis, no methodology for knowing how to even go about the process of figuring that out, then you can't do it. So, that was, and so I kind of coached this family through that process. And within not very long at all, like 2 weeks, they were from a situation where they were, at 300, 300 to 400 would be a normal blood sugar at all times, to a situation where they're now, between 100 and 200 or something like that. Yeah. And that's within a couple of weeks. And this was months and months and months after having been diagnosed. So the endos were working on this, for a long time. No, I'm not saying, we're better than the endos, but I'm saying that there's a way of coaching somebody through this that I think is really beyond the capacity of the endos. And I understand that it's, in terms of liability, problematic, but yet here are all these people going around without a real understanding of how to manage diabetes, and they kind of never will get it.
Well, I think, first of all, just your willingness and desire to be helpful to other people is really, it's lovely to see. And I think that the idea of liability is interesting because, what did you really tell them? You told them you probably need, more insulin to bring their blood sugar down. Here's a good place to start, I think. Here's what worked for me. And then it works for them. And then you were uncomfortable saying that you knew better than the endocrinologist, but you did in this story. So it's we all get caught on, trying to think of what the word I want, but it's, you didn't want to say, and you're not the only one, by the way, everyone comes on here and says something about their doctor and then goes, but I love my doctor. They always start with, I love my doctor. It's like, it's like saying, I don't know, my wife's a lovely woman. Now, she does sleep with a couple of guys behind my back, but, she's so nice to the kids. I don't like,
Right.
Sometimes we're always like qualifying, I guess. Like, and I get that. Like, I've said on here a number of times, my endos are terrific. Meanwhile, they're really great people, but I really only see them for about an hour a year. So I don't know how terrific they are or aren't. You know what I mean? Like, they're good to me. We don't go in there and have problems. I don't know what would happen if I walked in there and I was like, hey, my blood sugar's 400 and I don't know what to do. Maybe I wouldn't think they were terrific. Maybe maybe that would be unfair. I don't know.
Well, think about it this way: like if you need a psychiatrist or something, you go every week or more often than every week to try to get that dealt with. Whereas this is just as threatening as that, and just as curable as that, if not more so. And what would it look like if the healthcare system allowed you to go every week to a diabetes educator or someone until you kind of had a good understanding of it and really got how to do it on your own? Like, why is the system set up that you go every 3 months? It's crazy. And it's not a recipe for really learning how to manage a totally manageable disease on your own.
Well, I just had a conversation with somebody a few days ago, and I'm pretty sure I can't tell you who it is. So let's just say it's a person that I tangentially do business with through the podcast, and that they're in the position perhaps of helping people and trying to figure out how to help more people. And we had this exact conversation. So hold on one second. Arden is texting me. She's 81 diagonal down. She had a big muffin this morning, and we killed it. And we killed a little bit of a spike pretty easily. Wait, hold on. But the end of the attack is not going away.
Yep.
So she's going to take in a little sugar. And I said to her, do you have a couple like candies with you? And she goes, I don't know. Do I? She's asking me. And I'm like, I don't know. Look. And she goes, oh, I do.
So, maybe we should talk about teenager executive functioning later in the conversation.
So anyway, I'm talking to this person, and they are asking me my story about, how have I seen the podcast grow and what have I seen it do for people? Because I think I wear a couple of different hats in this. Like, I'm the nice guy that comes on and like talks to you, and I am the person who understands how to do the stuff. And I also put out episodes in ways where I think they're, poignant in times based on other ones, trying to build a narrative. There's a lot I'm doing probably that I do a good job of coming off like I'm not doing. Like, I'm like, oh, I'm just silly me making this silly podcast,
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I feel like I've built a way to help people.
Yep.
That didn't exist in the past.
Yep.
And so, so this person is trying to say, how do we help more people? And I'm like, man, that's like the underlying question behind every day of my life. Like, if it reaches, if the podcast reaches 5,000 people today, I always wonder, like, why couldn't it reach like 50,000 people? And not for the podcast, although that would be nice. I'm talking about like, if it's really working for a large portion of the people who are listening, I wish it could reach more people.
Yep.
And if it could, how? And then they started talking about that they had a network and that maybe they could be pushing out the podcast to the network. And then if they did that, which episodes would you want to send? And we were like having that whole conversation. So that thing you're thinking about is very cool that you're thinking about it. I'm thinking about it too. I'm sure other people are as well. Like, how do you give somebody like what in the end becomes like a card hanging on their refrigerator that's just like,
right.
This, and this. Have you done these things today? These are the things to do until it becomes commonplace. But do those steps need greater explanation? And I believe they do. Because
and hand-holding.
Of course, yeah. And they need to be able to come back to it or walk away from it. That whole thing. Let me grab a drink. And so what you said a while ago about, get your overnight basal right, I agree with. And I think that's a great place to start. I also think that you said something about doesn't matter if it's 300 or 400. There I take exception a little bit. Like I'm
only talking about for a week or two.
I know you are. And I didn't mean it like that. I meant that What if someone gets it stable at 400 and then decides, I'm going to go to insulin to carb ratio now, and doesn't follow through on the first step you gave them, which was get it right, then get it down, then go to insulin to carb ratio? Because if they do that, then take that second step without the first step being complete, they'll get thrown into a tailspin. They won't understand anything that's happening in front of them. And so you need somebody to keep checking in. Like you need a, if that, then this flow chart that's foolproof. And the problem is that nothing's foolproof, because in the end, the user is the biggest linchpin. And
the biggest fool.
Yeah, well, and that's, I didn't say that, Dan. I don't know what you're saying. But yes, sometimes we are the problem. Like I'm the problem in my house when I don't get something fixed, because I look at something and then I skip over the biggest part. If you listen to pharmaceutical companies, they'll tell you one of the biggest problems they have with medications are that people don't take them. Mm-hmm. Psychotropic drugs, like, stuff that helps you with depression, or I might have just used the wrong word there, but depression drugs, the biggest problem with depression drugs are people who are depressed take them, they stop feeling depressed, and their first consideration after they don't feel depressed anymore is, I don't need the medicine anymore.
Right. Skipping
over the idea that the medication is really probably the reason they don't feel depressed anymore. And so when you can't trust the user, then how do you know what's happening? And so for me, the best I've come up with so far is that the podcast exists in the world. And if you hear it the way it's delivered and you follow through on it the way I think it's, and I'm going to use the word manipulating, but I don't mean manipulating, but in the way that it's manipulating you to follow through, in the way that it's directing you, if that happens to hit you right, then most of my correspondence tells me your A1C is going to drop a couple of points. It's going to get down into the 6s. You can make it lower if you want. You're going to have these tools at your disposal that work for you, and you'll just kind of effortlessly know how to use them at some point. And then you'll go off on your way. I have not found a better way yet. If there is a better way, I don't know it, but I would just tell you that this podcast didn't exist 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that 5 years ago, what happened to people was they just decided that a high blood sugar was the best they could do and they'd move on. And then there was actually a support system built in the community to tell you that that's okay.
Yep.
And that's going away now. And I have to tell you, I feel good about that. I don't want people running around shaming others and going, you can't have a 300 blood sugar. That's wrong. I want them coming in and going, hey, I think I know how you could probably get that a little closer to where you want it to be. And I'm seeing that. And I'm incredibly proud of that. I might be prouder of the shift in how people talk to each other than I am in the shift of their A1Cs and their lesser variability. So,
yeah, and I think you should be, because, as I think about it, right, the only reason that I was able to counsel these folks was because I had been counseled by you. And I think it's really interesting to think about, right, I'm biased because I'm also a podcaster, but I think that it's fascinating to think about the power of whether it's a podcast or a blog or the internet or all these tools that we now have, which is basically now allowing regular people. Even the, what's it called, the software that creates the closed loop system that regular people put together.
Loop.
Yeah, Loop. So all of these things, right? So the technology has allowed people to create all these ways of basically sharing things with one another. And on the one hand, that's really great, and I'm thrilled, and you should be proud, and it's so wonderful that we have this capacity. But basically, what it's giving us is the capacity to go around the medical system, the healthcare system, as opposed to somehow the healthcare system being able to actually care for people properly, because I worry about the people, right? Because I'm frustrated like you about my podcast, right? I know for every person who listens, there's 10 people who I know would love it, but haven't heard about it. Like, what about all the people that are diagnosed with type 1 that don't listen to podcasts or that don't ever hear about it because in their community, there isn't a first person who, I'm in my community, I'm always telling people listen to the Juicebox podcast, but what about in a place where there isn't somebody like that, and it's like, I've heard you talk about also that we're all essentially running a warehouse in our homes for the healthcare, for the diabetes supply industry, for our insurance, that we all have a huge stockpile of stuff, it's like the whole system is broken. And I think that we're all finding these ways of doing our best to try to help one another. but it's frustrating because, the to some extent, the folks who are really in the position to make those tools more widely available don't or can't do it. And, I don't know exactly, again, if it's because of their concerns about liability or just their sense that that's not how we do things. But I wonder how we can break through that.
Yeah, there's a ton of sayings around change, right? And how it happens. And all I can tell you is what I've seen the podcast accomplish, right? Isn't just the podcast. It's the blog. So, so this goes back to 2007. And in 2007, diabetes blogging was very much, in my opinion, about telling people, look, this is what happens to me. Some of it's not good. You shouldn't feel self-conscious about it. We're not alone. Amazing message. Really fantastic message. Some people have a lot of success with that message. And that a lot of people, there are some people who have a lot of success delivering that message. And therefore they get stuck in that being their quote unquote business. They're in the business of delivering this shit hard, this stuff is hard, and I'm not always great at it. You don't always have to be great at it. There's a very uplifting, beautiful, psychological way of coming at it. And before Dexcom or, reliable pumps and all the things that kind of exist now, that maybe was the best you could hope for. And it was probably what that segment of time needed as far as a message went. The problem is that when some people started making money delivering that message, that was their brand. So they stayed into it. And then the technology changed and people like me came in and had a different experience living with diabetes or loving somebody living with diabetes. And even that, look what I just felt like I had to say. I know I don't have diabetes. Everyone listening to this show knows I don't have diabetes, but I still feel compelled to make sure I'm not talking about myself, because there are some old-time bloggers who exist who, because of their writings, I know that pisses them off. And then if I go find a 30-year-old who's had diabetes for 3 days and talk to them, they don't care if I talk like that. They understand I'm trying to get out a message and I'm trying to do it quickly. And I think that's also important. I think that the writing I used to see would go on for 600 and 700 words. And when you really read it, 2/3 of it was just apologizing for itself. Do you know what I mean? Or saying, some of those people knew they needed more insulin, but they spent more time explaining that they shouldn't be telling you that and making you scared of the idea through that explanation, that they never got around to telling you how to do it. I still saw one. There's a person who was absolutely lovely. The other day, I saw them post something about their health, and I'm like, my God, this person's first thought when they reach to people is still, let me say something scary about diabetes and then say it's going to be okay. Like, you must know more about it than this by now. How is it that this is still your explanation? And Dan, you're catching me on a day where I was already a little irritated because I see a lot of people setting up false narratives so that they can write about them. And I don't know if they know they're false narratives or if that's their experience. But today, it's 2019. It's almost 2020. And the people who are coming into having diabetes right now don't think like that anymore. And it's lovely that they don't have to think that way, that they have this different technology. But these are the people who are going to start the flood of how things are spoken about in the future. Now, I do my best to stick with the time. I really try to move along because I think it's best for my daughter. And hopefully I can continue to do that here. But if not, then some of these other people who have come in, God willing, some of them will realize that this is not about getting likes on their Instagram picture and figure out a way to really help people and keep this moving, or else this will die out. And then this ability to help people circumvent this system that changes much too slowly, it could disappear along with it. And I'm not saying I'm the only one doing it well, and I guess it's wrong of me to say that I think I'm doing it well. I think I am, but I'm sure there are other people doing it well too, or serving segments of problems that I don't get to. But the other people who are just like, look how pretty I am. I have diabetes too. Like my picture. That's great. Doesn't help anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, I mean, okay, it'll help them feel more comfortable showing you their pump. That's great. Now what? Do something else. If you've got all this influence, what are you going to do with it? And then they end up disappearing. I'll tell you right now, if you're listening to this right now and you have a lot of influence on a platform like Instagram, wait 12 months and tell me if you still do. Because if you're not actively trying to help people, then someone else will just come on whose butt looks better with an insulin pump on it, and then you'll be gone. So
right. Because I mean, the truth is that although I'm expressing frustration at the healthcare industry and the doctor's offices, the truth is that in our times, right, people who are diagnosed with diabetes, I assume all of them come home and Google, just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. What should I do?
Right.
And if the first thing that came up was the Juicebox podcast, then it would be a different world. Then it would be fine. I mean, then, I'd still rather that the doctor told you about it. But if you can find it immediately and you can sort of figure out or connect with the community very quickly and that helps you, then great. But if, like you say, the first things that you come up with are people with, bedazzled Omnipods, that's not going to serve that need.
The example I use in private company is always one that I don't think I could use here, but there's a person who has a spectacular looking, I don't know how to say it, buttocks, and they don't appear to care to cover it that much. And then everyone's like, they're a diabetes influencer. I'm like, that's a person with a great butt who happens to have diabetes, but I see what you think is going on here, and that's not what's happening. And some people see it. As a matter of fact, a lot of people see it, but there are also places where they're scared to ignore it because they think the likes are influence. And I hate the word influence. I'm not an influencer. I would never want to be called an influencer. I'm not trying to be an influencer. I am saying what I'm saying. You can do whatever you want with it. It doesn't matter. You could take it, leave it, anywhere in between those ideas. Do what you did, hear some stuff, and make an amalgam of it for yourself. As a matter of fact, that's my expectation. Like, I don't imagine that there are people out there beyond in the beginning writing down, Scott said this and this and this, and now I'm going to follow these steps. I'm hoping that it's opening their minds to a different way to use their insulin, and then they can make that work in their own lives.
Well, I'm curious what you think about in the connection of the bedazzled Omnipods and all of that, stuff about people displaying them proudly. I mean, that is a segue to something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I imagine maybe you are. And also when I wrote you, right, I was saying that, like, right, I listened to the Juicebox podcast religiously for the first 2 years. And then once I figured it out, I listened to it occasionally for just kind of to feel a sense of connection. I listen to it when there's a specific guest from Dexcom or from Omnipod on, but I listen to it less. But now it's on my mind again in a new way because I'm getting ready for the time when Sam's going to go off to college. And so there's this new concern that is not I've just been diagnosed with type 1, what do I do? But I'm now getting close to the point where, he's going to fly away from the nest. And have I set him up to be able to do this on his own? Right? I feel like I've become masterful at managing his diabetes, but he has not become masterful at managing his diabetes. Sure. And I think there are two elements of that, right? The one that the influencers, is positive for is that I do think that Sam and our friend who was diagnosed a year before him, they don't have any shame at all about having diabetes. They're not embarrassed for their Omnipods to show. They're both dancers, and there are these amazing pictures of them in performances with their Omnipods obviously clear, and that's amazing. And then I met this other kid recently who was recently diagnosed, and he is just trying to hide it, and he's really nervous about anybody finding out that he has diabetes. And we keep telling him, don't worry, nobody's going to care. Kids these days are so accepting, but he's intensely focused on that. So if that had been a kid that was just about to go to college, that would be a serious problem because he would probably not manage it well because he's trying to hide it. So at least that problem is not Sam's. But Sam's problem is that he's pretty good at managing it on his own. But for example, he, like most teenagers, is a very heavy sleeper. And I have this worry that, he's going to be off in college on his own and he's going to go low at night and he's not going to hear it. And how do I set him up to be ready to go off to college on his own in light of that, and then in general, does he understand well enough how to manage it when he's awake so that he'll still have a relatively low A1C. I'm a little worried about that. I'm a little less. I think he has a basic sense of it, but I'm still wondering, how can I get him, or what should I be doing over the next year and a half to fully get him to understand how to manage all these elements on his own, where the fact is that he's actually not all that interested in it.
Yeah.
Which I think is normal.
I have two thoughts. My first one was, and I just want to make sure I was clear about, I do think it's really important that somebody's out there showing themselves with their pumps and their CGMs, and then because it has that great effect on other people. Like, I'm not hiding, you don't need to hide. It's a good feeling, right? I'm saying once you have all these people following you, maybe do something more with it than that. That was my first thought there. My second thought is bigger on the idea of passing. We always talk about passing care, right? Like, because it's funny, you learned a particular skill. You learned how to be the father of a kid with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
That's what you know how to do. You don't know how to have type 1 diabetes.
Right.
Right. And your son is, and my daughter and everyone else who's born, diagnosed prior to leaving home, is going to go from being a person who's managed off into being a person who's managing, right? Their jobs are going to change. And in this segment of life that says, I don't sleep, I sleep tight and I don't wake up. And because they don't have, why do you pop up and your son doesn't? Why do I wake up and Arden doesn't? Well, I have the parenting thing, right? Like it's my responsibility not to let everybody die. Like that's how it feels inside. Have a baby, see how it feels. It's terrible. You know what I mean? Like you immediately are like, okay, well, I'll just eat whatever and get cancer and die. But as long as the kids are okay, everything will be fine. And I'll just leave them to my brother. And like, you know what I mean? Like you go right into like this defensive of life mode.
Right.
They don't have that. They don't know to be scared. They didn't have the, my daughter wasn't 30 the day I thought I lost her in a Macy's. You know what I mean? Like if she was there, she'd wake up when that alarm went off too. Like that kind of feeling. So they don't have that part. So I always maintain, you hear me say it, that I think being around it is a lot of a lesson, and that they're going to transition away, and then they're going to have their own experiences that aren't with us, and then they're going to figure out how to manage them. Now, here's the funny thing we never talk about. Much like side effects of diabetes that we don't talk about, and side effects of insulin, everybody kind of keeps quiet. Nobody says the stuff they don't want to talk about. The truth is this: every person isn't a shining example of perfection, right? And as a matter of fact, probably no one is. But we're all different, varying degrees of it. Like some people end up being more responsible than other people. Some people end up, being less. Some people work really hard. Some people don't work very hard at all. Some people care about their health. Some people don't. Some people are somewhere in the middle. Like we all end up being different people. But all of us who have kids with type 1 diabetes are trying to figure out how to turn each and every one of them into a guest that you've heard on the show who just went out into the world and was like, I'm going to take care of this, and just did a perfect job of it, and it's been going along great for 10 years. That's not going to be all of our kids. And so, because I think that's impossible to create, I think it's most important to look at your child and think, all right, this is who they are, and this is the kind of help they're going to need getting through. And I take very seriously the idea that I don't believe there's a cutoff date for when your kid just doesn't need your help anymore with diabetes. I saw someone the other day who, again, thinks of themselves as an influencer in this space, showing off their kid's 220 blood sugar and saying, oh, they're taking care of it on their own, they're learning. And I thought, you've been posting that for 3 years now. like I don't think they're learning. You know what I mean? Or it's the same story for years and years and years. And that person's decided to take the tactic of kids need to learn, they'll figure it out, and that's what I'm going to promote. And I've heard people promote my kid was diagnosed years ago, we didn't have all this technology, and look, they're fine. And then that's the idea they promote. Here's the idea I'm promoting. Figure out who your kid is and support them in a way that is reasonable to what their needs are. And that might go on beyond when they leave to go to college. That's it. That's it. There are some things I haven't heard from my son twice about, and there are some things he still needs help with. And so I sit back until he needs something, and then I don't do anything differently now than I did then. I'm like, hey, you all right with this? And, have you considered this? And he goes, oh, it's a good idea. And that's it. Because he wants the help. He doesn't want to ask for the help. He doesn't want to feel like he needs it. You can't make them feel like they need the help. You can't do that thing where you martyr yourself. You can't always be like, I'll take care of it. Yep. I'll tell you, all the drama's got to go away. You just gotta do the things you need to do. You know what I mean? It's like tending to a field. There's nothing sexy about getting a tomato to grow, but if you just do all the things you're supposed to do, it pops right out of the ground.
Right. I mean, I think that there are probably two dimensions of it, right? The one is the not dying part, and then the other is the excelling part, right? And on the not dying, it's like, so he went off to a camp for 6 weeks for debate this year, and actually it wasn't too far from our house, so if there was an emergency, we could get there. But I did a lot of research and found this thing that is really meant for deaf people who have babies, and the idea is that when the baby cries, the bed shakes because it's like a big vibrating disc that goes under the mattress or under the pillow.
Yeah.
So I got him that thing, and he really didn't want to use it, but he reluctantly, we told him that he had to, or he couldn't go to camp, and I think that he used it. The truth is that the year before we had to call the dorm people at least twice during the summer because he was going low, and we were calling him and he wouldn't answer the phone. And so, we had to send them up to wake him up and do something. Whereas this year we didn't have to do that at all. So I'm assuming that meant that the bed shaker worked. And so I'm kind of planning to send him off to college with this bed shaker. What's interesting is that when he came back from camp and we said, hey, that bed shaker worked so well, maybe you should just use it all year. He was like, no way. And we were like, well, why should I have to wake up when the alarm goes off? And he said, you're my parent. That's your job, in a really sweet way. But, he meant it. And I kind of was like, yeah, all right, I'm willing to do that. But, there's this question of okay, the not dying part is there. Am I going to feel good sending him off to college somewhere far away, knowing that at least he's going to wake up in the middle of the night if he's going low? And has his executive functioning got good enough that he always makes sure that he leaves the house at least with a candy bag or something, so that again, if there's a emergency, he's able to handle it. And then
Dan, will he find a different way?
Yeah, but will he find some way?
Yeah, his way.
Right.
And I think that's the hope, right? You just don't want him to be shaking on the ground before he figures it out. And then there are probably some adults listening right now who are thinking, man, you need something to go wrong so that you can figure it out. And some people will and some people won't. There are some people listening right now who are just ultra type A, super resilient, always like, I'm going to do the right thing. And they're just going to do the right thing right out the door. And there are going to be some people who have to bump into a bad moment to figure it out. And everywhere in between. I think it's a bit of a lot of people ask me, and in my opinion, there's no answer, right? There's no answer to the idea of like, what do I need to do to get my kid ready? If you really want to know what you need to do, in the next year, every pump company in the world is going to have a closed loop system. Figure out which one you like the best. I'm getting the Omnipod Horizon. And hopefully that'll keep my daughter from having a crazy low while she's away until she can figure out diabetes. But you know what? Some kid is going to get on that system and it's going to make them lazy. And they're just going to think, oh, well, I don't have to pay attention to it. And some kid's going to see it as a great, we are all incredibly different. If we were all the same, none of us would be able to get a job because we'd all be absolutely fantastic. You know what I mean? There'd be every job interview would be 1 million people lined up who are all perfect. And that's just not who we are. So, you can't shoot for someone else's idea of perfect. You have to figure out who you are and then make your stuff work within who you are. And I think that's got to be your focus moving forward. Now, you'll find a way to do it. The bed shaking thing's hilarious. And brilliant, by the way. And it's cool that it got you through that moment. And if your son ends up having a problem where he doesn't wake up forever, it might be something he might happily put under his mattress one day. And maybe he won't. Maybe he'll just make a joke, the first time he's with a girl and like, my dad used to try to shake this bed with the thing, but look how we just shook it. Who knows? And that's weird to think about Dan because he's your son, but that's going to happen too when he leaves. By the way, there'll be an After Dark series coming up about sex and marijuana smoking too. But I think that it's just a bit of a fool's errand to try to predict the future. And I don't know which person my daughter is going to end up being. I have absolutely no idea. The best I can do is bump and nudge her in the right direction, which is oddly how I think of parenting. Like if they get a little too far off, I'm like, oh, over there, back here. I think my job is, I've said this before, I think my job as a parent is to be able to repeat something a million times without sounding irritated by having to say it again, because they need to hear it a lot before it sinks into them. And so, you start off with this great message and then you get irritated because you have to say it a ton, but that was your job. And if you didn't want to do that, you shouldn't have a kid, because that's what's going to end up happening. They're going to need to know things. And, like you said, their executive function's not great until they get to a certain age. And then what if on top of that, your kid has diabetes and their blood sugar's crazy? Then their ability to think about things is even lesser. And no one talks about that. No one talks about, like, my blood sugar's 200. I'm probably a little altered.
Right.
But she's hard to get along with. What a short temper on that one, like that kind of thing.
Right.
Meanwhile, I get notes from people all the time. One of the things they're most grateful for when their kids' blood sugars become lower and stable is the return of a personality that they remember before diabetes. So I don't know. I think it's too much of, I think diabetes is a completely, like I said in the beginning, it's a small thing. Right? There's a couple of core truths about it. And then from there are a million leaves coming off of a million branches, and they all over time should be understood. The more of it you understand, I think the better chance you have of going in a direction that you want to go. So a lot of weird metaphors in there, but I don't think it's something you can learn all at once. I think you can get the basics down at once. I think there are some things people can tell you that will be helpful. Then it's up to you to how much you care about it. It's up to finding out how much time you have in your life to see how you can implement it. Are you going to end up being, I don't know if you saw this week, but I put up an episode with an adult type 1 who drinks a lot and came on and talked about it, because it just occurred to me one day, some people drink more than other people. Those people have type 1 diabetes too. So When I get off here with you, I'll be responding to an email from a guy in his mid-20s who said, I smoke a lot of pot and I have type 1. And I was like, great, come on and tell me about it. Because one of your kids is going to go off and smoke a lot of pot and have type 1. So they should have some base of idea of what to do about it. Like, I don't buy into the idea that you lie to people about what exists in the world, because then they won't get to it. I think they need to know what, I think that there will be some people who hear the drinking episode and hear a funny story about a woman who drinks a lot. And I think there'll be some people who hear it and go, I'm really glad to understand this, because I drink the way this person does, and I'm going to have to figure that out.
Yeah, it's also that, you think about diabetes as being something unique, but if your kid doesn't have diabetes, as you raise them, right, they don't drink throughout their childhood, throughout their teenage years, right? You keep them in terms of alcohol, you keep them in a good place. And then, when they go off to college, some of them are going to start drinking a lot, and some of those are going to drink forever, but most of them will not, will moderate it after a while. And so there's this period of time where, you've been working so hard to manage them in a very particular way, and then they're going to go off for a while and, and do their own thing. Like I think about that metaphor that you use a lot, about the idea of the sugar in your blood, being like sandpaper, right, and doing bad things in there. And so you work so hard to get a low A1C throughout their childhood, because that's your job as a parent. But then they're going to go off for a few years and their A1C might be higher. And how do you feel about that, right? Are you like, well, that's just part of growing up, and there's going to be this period of time when that might happen. And I've done them a real goodness as a parent by making sure that was the first time in their life when that happened, as opposed to it was the 11th out of 11, the 11th year in a row where that happened. And they're going to have to go through that period where, and hopefully it's going to be short, and so it won't have that kind of damage. And then they'll get to be more of an adult, and they'll have that executive functioning again, and they'll be able to ask for that advice or ask you what and that's true of any element of a child who's going off to college. So it's stressful, but it's also the same kind of stress in some ways that anybody feels.
100%. Arden is going to get a slightly tailored and different talk than my son did, but it's going to be the same idea. When my son left for school the night before he left, I pulled him into a room and I said, I don't think I need to tell you any of this, but I'm going to anyway. And then I said, Dan, I'm sorry, I'm going to curse and I'll beep it out later. I said, there are a few things in life that are unfuckable. And he said, what? I said, once you f them up, you can't unfuck them. And so I just went over those things, and some of them were not good. I said, you can't get a person pregnant because that doesn't go backwards. You can't kill a person. And I don't think you're going to go out there and murder somebody, but you can't hit someone with your car. You can't, there's a thing, if that happens to you, even if it's by mistake, it'll stick with you for the rest of your life, even if you're not injured. The idea of you hurting another person will alter your life in a way you can't imagine right now. And I went through a couple of things, and one of them for Arden, is going to be her health. If you send your health down a path that you can't get back off of, it's going to alter everything. And what's the point? Again, that's what I said to my son. I'm like, what's the point, man? I was like, everything you've done for these first 18 years, what's the point now of going and doing one silly thing that messes it up? Sure, it's not going to happen to most people. Most people aren't going to hit someone with their car. Most people aren't going to blow all these things that we talked about, right? I'm like, but if you are the person that happens to, that's it. You can't go backwards. That's who you are now. And that's where you move forward from. And maybe in some cases, you won't be able to move forward from that. Maybe that'll be where your life ends, with that one stupid mistake. I said, so there's just these few things. If you avoid them, you just have such a better chance. You know what I mean? So why not just avoid these few things? And to me, one of them for Arden is going to have to be, you have to avoid the desire to ignore your diabetes. And that's going to be one of the things I'm going to say to her. Whether she does it or not is another thing. But I'm releasing myself of guilt, by the way, Dan. I gave him that talk. If he goes out and gets some girl pregnant, I'm going to go oh, I told you not to do that. And so, and there were ways around it, my friend. But, it just, to me, there's only I was going to say there's only so much you can control. But what the truth is there's none of it that you can control. You know, the best you can do is just put them in the mindset that you think they're going to need to make that thing work. And then give them the ability to know that you're still here and you're happy to help whenever they need it. That's basically what I did. So the kid will work out or he won't work out. Arden will or she won't. She'll take her diabetes seriously or she won't. If she doesn't, I'll support her and try to help her do it. And, hopefully it won't turn into a situation where I'm the equivalent of a parent of a drug user, where I'm just constantly saving their life over and over again. And that's my toiling demise. I hope that's not my situation, but it's somebody's.
Right.
I just got reached out to the other day and said, can you talk about, hardcore drug use and how it affects people who have type 1 diabetes? I was like, I will look for somebody to look into that and see if I can't find somebody to talk to about it. That's a real, just think whatever the percentage of the population who are alcoholics or addicted to hard drugs, whatever that percentage of the population is, that's the same percentage of the diabetes population has that issue.
Right.
And, no one's talking to them about their blood sugars at all, probably. I don't know. And those people are someone's children.
Right.
So
I can see some promising spin-off series from the Juicebox podcast.
As long as it's not you, Dan, don't steal my ideas. Okay.
No, you should. All these people are going to work for you.
We're way over an hour. I have a question. You have a podcast. And so when did you start your podcast? What got you to start it?
I started it in 2016. And the truth is that I wanted to write a book. Our podcast is about thinking differently, thinking more creatively about the future of Judaism and ultimately about religion and wisdom traditions in general. And
Netflix didn't scoop in and try to get that from you?
Not yet. But there was that podcast company, right, that Netflix did a show about. So, it could always happen. Anyway, I wanted to write a book about it, but I felt like we needed to do more research and ended up saying, let's do the research in the form of a podcast. I never really thought that it was going to get a lot of listeners. So that was an exciting surprise. So then it became a thing in and of itself, but it started off as a research project.
That's amazing. Good for you. And you're doing incredibly well with it. I don't want to ask you how many listeners you have because that's private, but I love that that happened. And I think it talks about, I mean, it kind of shines light on what we've been saying the whole time, right? Like you started off by saying, I want to write a book, but instead I'll do this because it needs more air, right? I need to step back farther. I need to see more research. I need to understand more ideas. And then all of a sudden the thing you found grew into its own thing, probably makes the idea of a book feel a little unnecessary at times.
Yeah, and I think it's actually very similar to, I was griping about the doctors in the healthcare industry, but essentially, right, in some ways, your podcast and other endeavors are kind of going around that and ultimately giving people a path to get the information that they need outside of those institutions. And functionally, that's what I'm doing in my case, in the case of Judaism. But there are all kinds of ways in which the internet is making new pathways available to people. And, I think including me, it's, you still have a desire to gripe at the old system and why don't they figure it out and why don't they change? But the truth is that I think that those of us who are just kind of going forward in a different way are sort of solving that problem in a new way on our own.
Yeah.
The frustrating part for me, and I think the frustrating part for you, is just like, that I know it's not that right, like you said earlier, it's not for my ego and it's not for higher advertising rates, but it's that I know that there are people out there that need this information. And because I'm a 1-person, 2-person operation, without a lot of money, I don't have a marketing budget and I don't have a way to make sure that the word is out. If I had a way to if I knew, for example, that every single person who is diagnosed with diabetes came out with a subscription to the Juicebox podcast, I don't think I would really care what was going on in the Endo office. But because I know that there are all these people that are going out and that never hear about it for 10 years, or I worry about, then I worry that there are people who could manage their diabetes so much better. And in my case, the people could have so much of a richer internal life or richer spiritual life, whatever you want to call it, and just never heard about the new way of getting that. And instead they go to the old way, like a synagogue in my case, or an endo office in your case, and I know what information they're getting there, and it's not the information that they really need or want, and that's frustrating. So, part of it is that I think, and I'm sure that what we're doing on the internet is eventually going to grow up. Like we were talking about a kid growing up and going to college, like our work is going to grow up and go to college, and there are going to be all kinds of new ways that people connect with this stuff. And we just happen to be living through this early stage of it where it's all new and it's the Wild West. And on the one hand, that's so exciting and awesome. And on the other hand, it's frustrating because that's where the really good stuff is happening, but not everybody knows about it. And that's just like you're saying about the kid going to college. Like, it is what it is. That's just what we have to deal with right now.
I have to say that I understand your frustration, and I've said it already here, but it's palpable. Like the idea that you can't, you feel like you have this stuff, whatever you want to call it. It's an idea, and you've seen it be helpful, and you'd like it to help more people. And like you said, this is just me. Like, this podcast is me. And so I have to grow it and believe in it, and then adjust it where it's not right, and then let it grow. And if it's the right tool, it'll make it. Like, I hate to say it like that, but I definitely feel like that. Like if this podcast is what I think it is, and I tend to it properly, then it will continue to grow, and it will continue to help people, and it will find more people. And if it doesn't, then I will take that as an indication that either it wasn't the right vehicle, or I wasn't the right driver, or maybe a combination of those ideas, and that somebody else hopefully will come along and pick up the mantle and move it forward from here. I certainly am standing here, on the backs of a lot of really brilliant people, some of whom it may have sounded like I trashed earlier, but I wasn't. They were people who got caught in a space and they stayed there. And I saw what they did, and I thought, I don't want to just do that. I've told that story here before. I'm like, I don't want my blog to just be this thing that makes other people feel like, oh yeah, diabetes sucks. That guy agrees with me. I don't want, it's got to help people. How can I do that? And then I stepped through those ideas. The podcast exists because I saw blogging going away. I had 2 million clicks a year. And then all of a sudden 1 year I had 1.5 million. And I was like, uh-oh, I don't think I'm doing anything different. What's going on? So I started asking friends I had who were doing it. They were all seeing it slip on. And I thought, all right, I'm not going to stand here on the Titanic till it's just me and, Leo on the headboard. Like, I'm getting out now, so I didn't bail on my blog. I use my blog, I think, in a really good way still, but I'm like, how do I build on this and make it something else? And then I followed the only skill I had, which is being able to endlessly talk. And so I'm like, well, let me try this. And it caught on. I've seen other people launch podcasts that don't catch on, and they're about the same idea. There are other people who launch diabetes podcasts and they don't get 4 people listening to them. And then that's the end of it. And so I don't take that as an indication that I'm better than they are. It's just that whatever this is and whatever I am all mixed together, people seem to be enjoying. And so that's it. I'll try to make it bigger and it'll get as big as it can. And I don't mean big as in successful. I mean big as in reach.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I've never said this on this podcast, Dan, but there's something about having you on here that makes me say this. It's almost, I think, inappropriate. I'd never know. But I always relate how I feel about the podcast to the last scene of Schindler's List. And I'm not making this up because you're here. There's a moment in the movie, which I don't know if it's based on real fact or not, but I think he recognizes, Schindler does, that he has a piece of jewelry left over he didn't realize he had. And you can see over his face the wash of like, I wonder what I could have done with the money I could have gotten for this jewelry. And the sadness on his face about things left, to the devices of the world that he felt he could have intervened with. And these are not an apples to apples feeling, of course. I don't mean that in any way. But when I get a note back from somebody and it talks about the change in their life, I feel good about the note, and then I wonder what I did wrong and why that one note wasn't 5 notes. It just hits me that way. So.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing that I would sort of add to that is that I know that not everybody feels this way, and not everybody has to feel this way. And if your kid is diagnosed with diabetes and all you want to focus on is your own kid, I think that's totally legitimate. But I think that a lot of us are desperate to help other people. And like, I've actually thought about, not really, but I've thought about, maybe I should become a clinical diabetes educator. Like I'm really good at this, but I love my career. I don't want to change what I'm doing only because I happen to know that I would be really good at this. But the question is there more that I can do as someone who doesn't have a diabetes podcast? Is there something more that I could do to help a few people? And that's, to me, that would be the next step beyond the podcast, for you. I mean, not that you have to do it, or that somebody inspired could say, okay, how do I now make a way for all the people who feel grateful to this podcast for the help that it's given them and kind of pay it forward in light of the fact that I know that the healthcare organizations, doctors are not really making that something that's easy to do. So is there some kind of way, could we be like community organizing on our own in each city so that, somehow, I don't know, we have someone stationed outside the hospital that watches when somebody leaves the endo so that they can follow them? That's pretty creepy. But, how do you get that information? But like, how do you at least kind of make it clear that some volunteer whose advice is not medical or otherwise is going to show up at your house and sit with you for as long as you need it, hold your hand, help you understand that it's actually totally manageable, and coach you through the process of managing it so that which again I think is something that's totally doable in a matter of weeks, and instead people spend years not really able to manage it and not getting good results. And that's the part where I feel like, how is there more that I can do, and all the other listeners of the podcast, how is there more that we can do to amplify what you're doing beyond just the audience for a podcast? Even it can grow to be as big as it can be. There's still always going to be more people that, don't listen to podcasts. I think
that question really boils down to like scalability, right? Like, how do you scale the podcast to reach more people and so that it works when you get to them? And that's a tough question to answer. Like at the moment, what I'm doing in the next 6 months to address what you said initially is that I'm taking offers to speak at JDRF events in cities that people don't get excited to go to very often. So, and I don't mean any, there's some bigger cities and you'll see people in the space like, oh, I'm speaking at this one. It's a huge event, 600 people at it. And instead I've made myself available to the rest of them. And it makes you sad when you get the initial phone call and they're like, look, you probably wouldn't be interested in coming here. That's how they start. And I'm like, no, why? Are there people there who have diabetes? I'm like, yeah. I'm plenty interested. And so I'm going to go do some of them. And then I'm going to do some larger ones to try to build up the idea that, so other people can see me, my visibility, so that I can go find other ones. And I'm going to do as many as I can. I think at this point, I've put more on my calendar than I should have. I think I'm going to go speak like 8 or 9 times in the next 6 months. And that's more than I should be doing for my own, it's not a money-making endeavor. It's not like a business. It's a time suck, to be perfectly honest, And, but you go out and you reach 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 people. Most of them are newly diagnosed. And then you have this real opportunity to put them on the path that exists today instead of the path from 2008 that someone's probably going to tell them about.
Yeah.
So I figure if I can go start those little bonfires in enough corners of the country, then they'll spread. And then one day I'll just get on here and rant and rave for 2.5 hours about everything I hate. And that'll be the last episode of the podcast and that'll be it. And so, and I will have done my thing. I said to somebody recently, I hope one person shows up at my funeral and says, that guy helped me be healthier. Like that's really that's kind of how I feel about it. And so it gets lost for some people because I get through this podcast with a lot of sarcasm and humor, and some of it's darker. And I think that maybe some people wouldn't believe that about me, but I really just want people to be healthier. I want parents not to cry in the shower. I want kids to be able to go off to college without having to think too much about it. I want 35-year-old people to not wonder when their eyes are going to start needing tending to. Like that's just the kind of stuff I want. And I figure if I grow it here, and maybe I'll understand it enough to help my own daughter with it. And that's pretty much it. It's not all that altruistic. It didn't start that way, at least. This whole thing started with me trying to figure out how to help my daughter.
Yep.
And so that's it, man. I don't know.
Yep.
That's it. I very much appreciated talking to you. We've gone way over an hour, but that's fine. If you wouldn't mind, could I, after we say goodbye on the podcast here, could I talk to you for a second? Probably.
Yep.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yep.
Did I leave anything out that you wanted to say? And by the way, if you wanted to help in your own community, I'll come out and speak in Chicago. Get some people together and we'll put people in motion, and then maybe we'll create more of you, and that'll be more people that reach more people, and you can feel good about that,
All right. Well, thanks for that. I'll look into what I can make happen.
So I'm sorry, did we not go over? I'm sure we didn't.
No, I think that was good. That was. I think nothing jumps out at me. Cool. I think we talked about the main things. Yeah.
So, Dan, what's the name of your podcast?
It's called Judaism Unbound.
Very nice. And I can get it all the places where podcasts are podcast.
Yep. And if you just search for Judaism, it's usually the first one that pops up.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Huge thanks to the Contour Next One blood glucose meter and Touched by Type 1 for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Go to contournext.com/juicebox or touchedbytype1.org to visit the sponsors. There's also links in your show notes and available at juiceboxpodcast.com. And huge thanks to Dan for coming on and going, I thought, toe-to-toe with me, because I was super talky during this episode, and when I gave him a chance to talk, he came right back. It was very well thought out, great at delivering his thoughts. I really appreciated him being on. Dan's podcast, Judaism Unbound, is available everywhere the podcasts are available, and I have never heard it, so I can't tell you anything about it, but I can tell you it's incredibly popular. If that sounds interesting to you, Judaism Unbound. Thank you very much for listening to the Juicebox Podcast, supporting the show with listener reviews at Apple Podcasts, by sharing with other people. I very much appreciate it. We'll be back later this week Who's we? It's me. I'll be back later this week with more episodes. Thanks so much for listening.